Hello and welcome to the second lesson on the topic of global development. This session is going to be looking at ways that we can measure development, so using single and composite development measures, which I'll explain as we go through the session. So please write down this title when you're ready, unpause the screen, and I'll explain what we're going to be doing in this session. Okay, we're going to begin this session with a bit of a recap, but which is relevant to this topic. By looking at that definition we encountered last session on what we call human or social development. So human or social development, remember, is the extent to which people have access to wealth, employment, knowledge and education, health and nutrition, leisure and safety. So all of these things, your ability to get money, a job, education, good healthcare, good food, lots of calories, things to do, feeling safe, low crime rates, whatever. These are all things which we kind of put into this bracket of human or social development. And it's really important because if you don't have those things, your quality of life will suffer and you're more likely to be a less developed country or a developing or emerging country. Okay, now we can measure this, we can measure human development by looking at some specific individual things, so what we call single measures. And those single measures, I'm going to use an analogy to kind of explain what we mean by those. So the analogy I'm going to use is top trumps. Top trumps, if you've never played it, firstly, who are you? But secondly, it's a game where you've got a certain card with statistics on it. Now that could be a car. And on that card, it gives you loads of stats like top speed or value or I don't know how many Formula One races it's won or whatever it might be. Now, if you think of each card as a country, and on that country's card, it's got loads of stats. And those stats can be things like death rate, number of people that die per 1,000, or life expectancy, average age you can expect to live, or number of doctors per 1,000, or how much money the government spends on healthcare per person. Okay, now they would all be stats that you could compare country by country. So every single one of these things at the top here, although this, by the way, I'm going to tell you this now, massively out of date, these are what we call development indicators, and they're single measures of development. So I can see that Afghanistan, when this figure was taken, the life expectancy was 44. The average age an adult lived to was 44. Shocking, I know. Now in the UK, let's take the UK, somewhere familiar to us, that same stat was 79. So the people in the UK lived nearly double the age on average that people in Afghanistan did. Now, if we take that single measure, it can tell us which one is more developed. The UK, based on that single measure, is more developed than Afghanistan. Okay? Because it's clearly got better healthcare. People live longer. However, it's not the only thing that could lead to that particular statistic. So a single measure is good for a very brief snapshot. 44, 79, this one's a better age, that means it's more developed. But why is Afghanistan so low that might not be anything to do with development? Well, Afghanistan, you may not know this, but Afghanistan suffered massively with conflict. And most of the people that fight in conflict are people between the ages of 18 to 50. And so when they get killed in conflict, what that does is it lowers the average life expectancy of the entire country, especially if it's a conflict which goes on for a long time. So that actually might not necessarily be, as a single measure, tell you the whole story. So you need more than one measure, okay? You need to look at other things, and because we've got all these different stats, we can say, okay, what else is there that tells us that Afghanistan is less developed than the UK? How much money per person do they spend on healthcare? $4. How much money do the UK spend per person on healthcare? $2,981. Huge numbers of money compared to Afghanistan. Now these two things between them tell us very clearly the UK is a more developed country than Afghanistan because we spend more on healthcare and we've got a longer life expectancy. And these are both health-based measures. So remember our definition, the extent to which people have access to wealth, employment, blah, 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 health and nutrition. This one tells us the UK has good access to healthcare. Okay? Now, some of these measures help us with regards to wealth, GDP, for example. Some of it talks about maybe, well, it doesn't really mention education in any of these stats, does it? So we're missing some stats which could really benefit and give us an overall view of how developed a place is. But any one of these is what we'd call a development indicator, and it's a single measure of development. So what I'd like you to do, we need a summary of some single measures of development. Now you can pick a couple of these, that's fine. You know, life expectancy, government spending per head, that's absolutely fine. Okay, but I want you to cover a range that gets not just health-based data and not just wealth-based data, but I also want to see any data that you could, or any stats that could tell you about education in a place, or maybe leisure or safety in a place. Okay, so number of murders per person in that country, or access to sporting facilities, for example. Okay, number of gyms in that country. All right, anything is a single measure of development which could tell you about how socially developed a country is. So the way you're going to do that is using a mind map. In the middle of your mind map, I'd give yourself a double page, because I'm going to explain how you're going to put this together. A double page of your book. In the middle, you write development indicators. And if you want to put single measures, that's fine too. But these are measures, single measures of how a country is improving. And then around that, your first layer is going to be adding just a range of development indicators. So one that wasn't on the last slide, literacy rate. So look up literacy rate, define it. Literacy rate is the number of people in the country that can read and write. Illiteracy rate is the opposite, the number of people that can't read and write. Okay? But around your spider diagram, your mind map, whatever you want to call it, you could have a variety of measures. So GDP per person, number of doctors per head, amount of spending on healthcare, average number of calories consumed per person. Okay, all of these things are stats that could go on a top trumps card, but will tell us how developed a country is in terms of its wealth, its employment, its education, its healthcare, etc. All right. Now that's the first layer of the mind map, but mind maps are more complicated than that. So the second layer, and this is more important because this is going to link more to an exam question. You are likely to get an exam question that asks you to explain how a certain thing shows a place is or isn't developed. So that's the third layer, or the second layer of the mind map. Try and explain how that development indicator can show development. So what does literacy rate show about a country and how developed it is? Well, it's a measure of how many people can read and write, which is how educated they are. So this shows a well-educated society, if it's got a high number, for example, and that will tell you that it is educationally developed as a country. Okay, so take the development indicator and then explain why that shows a place is more or less developed than another place. All right, so these two layers, stats first. Okay, what are the different types of development indicator, followed by how or why that shows a place is more or less developed. Okay, now do this first. I would say this is going to take you 20 to 25 minutes to do. And if you want to include an example in that as a third layer, that is even better. So that's like an extension task for you, okay? Include a specific example. What I would say is don't include the examples from the last slide because the stats are out of date, okay? But you can look this up on Google really easily. Now, as we go, we might want to add extra development indicators that you spot throughout the rest of the session. So when you're ready, you can pause the screen, crack on with this task for 20-25 minutes or so, however long it takes you, and then when you're ready, unpause the screen and we can carry on. Okay, so the development gap is what we kind of call the distance between places that are developed and places that are developing. And there is a wide recognition that the development gap in the world is growing, because some parts of the world are wealthier than others and have more money to spend on certain things, but also some parts of the world have other things like corruption and all these other aspects which can affect their development. Now, what I'd like you to do with your mind map, which you've just completed, is firstly, I want you to color code it, all right, or categorize it. So I want you to take all of your development indicators that you've put on there, and I want you to tell me if they are an economic one, a social one, a technological one, or a multivariate one. Okay, now this one, ignore for a second. I'm actually going to do that separately. So just these three: social, economic, technological. Now, if you haven't got any technological ones, I've put bullet points in there of development indicators you can add to your mind map. So mobile phone access or access to the internet. Again, Google search different countries, how much access to the internet or coverage there is, for example. So you've got an example of a technological, economic and social development indicators. All right. So once you've color coded your key, then work out what you've got. So people per doctor, life expectancy, literacy rate, these are all social ones, so you can color code those social. These GDP per person, GDP in overall, that's economic, and anything to do with tech is technology. All right, so energy, internet, mobile phones, that sort of stuff. Okay, so pause the screen while you go through and do that, and then I will talk to you about this last thing, multivariate stuff. Okay, so hopefully you've now color-coded your mind map, so you've now classified your different development indicators into social, economic and technological. Multivariate is, at the start of this lesson, you'll see on the lesson learning objective, we wanted to work out what we call composite measures of development. And that's another way of saying multivariate. Multivariate just means a way of measuring development which combines separate single indicators. And the best thing we've got, and the thing that we use globally to measure human development, is the Human Development Index, or the HDI. Okay, and we're going to do a bit more on that in a bit. So single measures and composite measures. Single measures are one thing. Composite measures are a combination of different things that give you a better overall view of development. So we're going to start with the single measures, and you need to write some notes please on this. So firstly, one of the most commonly used is GDP, or gross domestic product. And gross domestic product is, in the most basic form, all the money that a country makes in a year through trade or brand value or all these things. And in wealthy countries around the world, this is in the trillions. That's not a made-up number, all right? Trillions is a real number, and it really exists. So billion is 1,000 million. A trillion is 1,000 billion. So a trillion is a million million. You following? Probably not, but it doesn't really matter, okay? Now, GDP can be a big number, and you can compare that number easily between countries. Less developed countries will have lower GDPs, and more developed countries will have higher GDPs. So again, you can get these notes down for your book. And I've got some examples. Now, GDP per capita is a way that we can actually make this a little bit easier to write, because if you're talking about a million, the amount of zeros on the end of that figure is stupid. So writing that down and comparing it can be a bit of a pain. The better thing we can do is, if we divide that number by the population, it will give you a number of money, or amount of money generated per person in your country, and that gives us a bit more manageable number to work out. Okay, so GDP per capita is the same thing, okay, all this money, but it's just divided it per person to make it a bit smaller for us and see really how much wealth there is per person across the whole country. So some stats. The USA's GDP in total, $20 trillion. So $20 million, and that was 2018, so not too out of date. China's GDP, I think the same year, not sure, was 14 trillion. Malawi's GDP was 7 billion. Okay, so 20 trillion is 20 million. 14 trillion is 14 million. 7 billion is 7,000 million. So there's a big difference there. A big difference. Malawi is far poorer overall in terms of its GDP than China and the USA. Much poorer. Now, per person, if you divided that by the population, that would change quite a lot. But we're just going to look at the total figure for now. So the USA has got, again, this is a bit of quick maths here, nearly 3,000 times as much wealth as Malawi. 3,000. That's insane. Nearly 3,000 times more money than Malawi. Okay, now per person, if we divided that up, China's population, which is 1.3 billion or so, that would share that 14 trillion out much more thinly than the population of the USA, which is what, 300 million? Okay, I don't know the figures off the top of my head. It's still a big number, but that 20 trillion, which is already bigger than China, is, if you share it out with a smaller population, shows that per person the USA has far higher GDP wealth. Okay, so why is GDP not a very good way to measure development? Well, there's a number of reasons for that, okay, but money isn't the only thing you need to consider, and single measures are always a little bit sketchy. So even if a country is wealthy, it's got a large income, like the USA, it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's got that share. So GDP per capita, so the wealth per person, yeah, all great, and it shows you how wealthy people would be if everything was spread evenly, but it's not. The world isn't an even place. So there are people that are really super, super wealthy, and there are still people that aren't very wealthy at all. So a large income per country or GDP per person doesn't necessarily mean that it's a developed country, because you could have a few super rich and then not a big number of not very wealthy at all. So one example of this, and again, write all the notes down you want to write down from this, please. Qatar, which is in the Middle East, has got one of the highest GDP per capita in the world anywhere, $75,000 per person on average. But it's only a small number of people that have the big wealth. So actually, it's not evenly distributed, and lots of people in the population are nowhere near that wealthy. So it's clearly not a fully developed country. And again, to illustrate that, although Qatar's GDP is over 200 times greater than a country called Myanmar, 200 times more, Qatar's got a lower literacy rate than Myanmar. So Myanmar is 200 times less wealthy per person than Qatar, and yet it's got more people that can read and write. So money isn't necessarily the best indicator of development, because development, remember, includes more than one thing. Alright, so if you haven't got all the notes there, please feel free to pause the screen. I'm going to crack on. So now, composite measures. These are far, far better to show how a country is developed, because they cover more than one thing. So again, I'm sorry about all the note taking you've got. So a composite measure, or composite index measures, include, the one that you need to know really is the HDI, the Human Development Index. And what that does is it takes into account both economic wealth and some social development indicators too. So this covers economic factors and social factors, and it comes up with a score. Now that score is between 0 and 1. 0 would be not developed at all, there's literally nothing there, no human life, etc. Nowhere is 0. And 1 is perfection. Okay, places that have an HDI of 1 are perfect. So the number is normally 0 point something something something, and that along that line, that number line between 0 and 1 will tell you how developed a place is. So Norway's HDI, the most recent figures I've got, show that it's got a score of 0.944. That is very good. That's really close to 1. Norway is an incredibly developed country. Chad in Africa has got an HDI of 372. Now that is far closer to 0 than it is to 1. It's well below half, and that tells me that Chad is a less developed country. Okay, so this idea of HDI is this number closer to 1 is better, closer to 0 is worse. Now, what is HDI made up of? Well, 3 things. Okay, these factors, and this is something which an exam board will potentially ask you because they have in the past. So HDI works out this score using, firstly, the income per person. So not the whole wealth. This takes people's actual salaries and then divides out per person. So there's the wealth bit to begin with. Then how many years of schooling on average they get. The higher the number, the better. And the life expectancy from birth. So these 3 things: money, education, healthcare. Those three things are covered in the HDI, the Human Development Index. So we work out the scores for these and they come up with a way to come up with this number between 0 and 1. So please remember these three things are what's included in the HDI, because they could say name a measure included in HDI, and it could give you four options. It might say GDP, it might say number of doctors per person, it might say birth rate or literacy rate or whatever, and then it might say life expectancy from birth. The only one that's used in the HDI is life expectancy from birth of those options. So you need to know all three of these, and the fact that these three things are included in the HDI, nothing else. All right? Okay, so make sure you've got those notes written down, circle those, highlight them, do whatever you want to do, put exclamation marks and stars next to them so you know that they are what make up the HDI. Okay, so you've got an understanding now of single and composite measures, and this just shows you the global pattern of human development. So again, the color coding on the map here is on the key here, but this is from 2018, so it's the most recent one I've got for you. Any place that's grey, there is no data available. So, for example, Somalia over here, there's no data for there, and Greenland. But most places, and North Korea as well, most places have got some form of kind of data available. Now, the darker the green, the more developed. These are places, all these places have got scores, HDI scores of 0.9 or higher. So the UK, France, Germany, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Canada, USA, Australia, New Zealand, all of those are the darkest green. Okay, they are the most developed. Iceland as well up there. Anything with, again, slightly less dark green, slightly lower score, and vice versa. And anything kind of yellow to orange to red have figures that are not so good. Okay, so anything really this kind of darkish orange to red are places that are the least developed countries in the world. And again, there's no surprise probably to many of you that they occur in Central and Sub-Saharan Africa. Which I'm sure many of you could have identified even before I showed you this map. So this shows you a pattern of human development, and the Human Development Index, which remember includes the income per person, so GNI per capita, the life expectancy from birth, and the average number of years for schooling. Alright, so that gives you a good composite idea about where in the world is and isn't as developed as everywhere else. Alright, so now another skill that I'd like you to do before the end of this session is to just do a bit of a mind map, or sorry, a line graph, because you will get questions about types of graph that you could use, but this is going to just get you to practice that skill. So you can do it in your book, is absolutely fine, but this shows you the development, the Human Development Index for Malawi, the UK and Mexico. So I've picked a less developed country, a developed country, and a developing or emerging country that we've kind of encountered in other topics. We haven't encountered Malawi before, but I've thrown them into the mix. So you've got three dates here. They don't quite go in the same order, but it's 10 years between them, 9 years between this one. And what I'd like you to do is plot along the x-axis the years, along the y-axis the scores, okay, from between 0 and 1. Work out your levels, how you want to do the scale, and then I want you to plot a line for Malawi, a line for the UK, and a line for Mexico. Alright, so use scales, sensible scales, label the axes, and try and use a different colour line for each country. That would be handy. So pause the screen, get on and do that please, and when you're ready you can unpause the screen and I'll show you what it should look like. Okay, so here is a graph which should be something along the lines, or similar to what you've done. So Malawi, far less developed in terms of its HDI than the UK and Mexico. Mexico is kind of getting there. The UK's the highest of the three, and these two are slowly kind of improving, whereas Malawi has managed to get quite a lot of gains over the last 10 to 15 years, and that shows that it's able to develop a bit more rapidly as maybe wealth are being generated and things like that. Okay, sorry if a bell goes, by the way, it's getting near the end of a session. Now, another thing I'd like you to do, and this one I don't want you to have to draw particularly, but this one is another illustration of how one measure shows something completely different to another measure. Now this one shows the GDP of those same three countries. Okay, now the UK's GDP, you can see, is far higher than everybody else's. Mexico's GDP, quite a lot lower, less than half the UK, and Malawi's GDP, well, basically doesn't register on this particular graph. It's right there, skirting along the bottom. So what this tells us, it shows us that it doesn't matter about your wealth, particularly. It doesn't mean that this same gap of wealth will create a same gap of human development index. All right. So have a little look, pause the screen, and then answer these 3 bullet point questions on GDP. Okay. And when you're ready, unpause the screen. So political corruption. Something I need to mention too, okay, because again the exam board mentioned this, and this is just pretty much you writing notes down. All right, so the quality of a government is massive when it comes to working out development. Now, again, wealthy countries, if they've got a corrupt government, again, it means that that money might not go to where it should go to help the overall country develop. It might just be lying in the pockets of certain individuals within government. So countries where the quality of government is poor and there's high corruption often are places with less development. And there's also another way of measuring corruption. It's the corruption index, which grades countries from highly corrupt to very clean or not very corrupt. Okay, and there you go. You can see the top countries there. Denmark has nailed it basically for the last sort of 3 or 4 years, and it's got really, really high scores. The UK, it manages to sort of stick around the top 10. Okay, so there's a bit of corruption definitely going on in the UK. The bottom countries, again, you can have a look at where they come from. It tells you the regions on the right there. Europe, not a very corrupt continent, whereas Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa are far more corrupt than maybe other places. All right, so these are the rankings they get. The worse the rank, the worse, the more the corruption. Okay, so again, couple of activities for you to do. Please pause the screen, try and answer those 2 questions, and when you're ready, unpause the screen. Okay, and I'm not going to make you do this one. This is something which is just a bit of a summary of what you've covered now. But what I am going to ask you to do very quickly is just to summarise the end of this session. There's 2 questions for exam question practice. One of them is name one composite measure of a country's development. That should be really easy. One composite measure, one combined measure. We've only learned one, so that number should be just 3 initials, okay, or you can write the 3 words out. This one, suggest one reason why GDP is not a good way to measure development for 3 marks. So this is practicing using, telling me one reason why GDP is not good for measuring development, and extend it a couple of times to get those 3 marks, just to sharpen up your exam practice skills, and again hopefully relate some of your learning today to the test. Alright, I'm going to leave you with that as the final task this session. It's been another long one, but thank you for listening. Hopefully you've got a good idea about single and composite development indicators or measures, and hopefully again you can work out which one is more or less useful to you to work out if a country is or is not developed. Thank you very much for listening, and I will see you next time. Cheers.